I am going to start with the news of the day, of course, and these massive demonstrations that we're seeing and protests across the country against police brutality and systemic racism. I don't remember the last time I've seen anything on this scale about this issue. Greg Bowens, what are we seeing, and what is the opportunity that this inspires real change, that it actually leads to things being different?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a wake-up call in a way that we hadn't seen before. And part of it, I believe, has been induced or exacerbated by the lockdown during the coronavirus. For the first time, we saw a Black man getting killed by police, and there weren't the usual distractions that were out there that people had to contend with. People weren't rushing to drop their kids off to school. They weren't rushing to get to a meeting. They didn't have all of these other things that tend to divide our attention. And the shock of having to watch that video and look at the smirk on that cop's face while the life was drained out of that brother on the ground was, I think, overwhelming. There was just no way to escape it in the ways that people normally are able to escape it. And since they were on lockdown, I think that this allowed for them to be able to focus more than we'd ever seen before. Curiously enough, there's been 5 different protests in the Grosse Pointes and Harper Woods, at least 5. Only one of them was organized by, older folks, the NAACP, WeGP, the Grosse Pointe Dems. But the other 4 were all organized by people between the ages of, I want to say, 18 to 22, 23. And these were white folks, by and large. And the second to the last protest I saw stretched for 6 blocks. And curiously enough, there weren't a lot of Black folks that were involved in it. And so that's one of the things that's kind of amazed me about this, is that while the attention has been paid in Detroit, we've seen protests all over southeastern Michigan, even in Livonia, even in Westland, even in places we would have never thought to see a protest. And I think I think we're seeing something new here. Yeah. From that perspective.
Karen, does this mean we are going to get past these issues? I mean, when I think about Eric Garner and when that happened, Trayvon Martin, these were all before Colin Kaepernick started kneeling in his uniform before football games, and nothing changed when those people were killed. Nothing changed when Colin Kaepernick started kneeling. What's different this time?
Well, I pinned a piece of news saying how this appeared different. It felt different. But I don't want to dismiss the contributions or the support of anybody participating or wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt or with a sign. But we've got to move past symbolic gestures and start looking at the contributing factors to systemic racism. You can't wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt afraid of speaking to a Black person that you encounter them on the street. So to me, this is a good first start, but just because they're marching with you doesn't mean they're marching for you, because we've got to allow the peeling back of a very aged scab that will reveal some very painful things about the very people that are marching. There was an interview for one of the protesters on one of the local stations, and she was being asked, what this meant to her. She couldn't tell you what it meant. So Greg talked about not having the distraction of other things because of the quarantine and the lockdown. A lot of people are participating because they want to make a change. But you have a section of people that are just out because they're in lockdown. They want to feel a part of something. But until we really have candid discussions, until we look in the mirror, and until white people look in the mirror and look at their colleagues and say, this is what you cannot do, this is who you are, and this is your contribution to a generational problem, then no, nothing will change. I saw the PBS special on the Black Panthers the other night, and the same thing happened then. You had all these white college students that were out protesting. So we've got to get past just the movement and start building momentum toward legitimate change.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Stephen, can I add one more thing on that?
Sure, go ahead.
One of the reasons why I think we're seeing this too in a lot of white communities is because you don't have to take a side in a very personal way. It's not, the police chief in your town that you're railing against, or some cop that arrested a Black person or killed somebody in your community. This is what happened in Minneapolis, and I can safely protest here to say that we need to make change. But like Karen is pointing out, until we start asking for a particular change in the area where you live, that's when I think you're going to see some difficult conversations.
But change starts within the heart, though, and that's what people don't want to. Just like we're in the middle of a pandemic because people don't think their germs are bad. People are still sneezing and coughing without covering their mouths. People have to look at what they do to contribute to the issue. The lady in Central Park, who called the police because of the guy was watching birds. Or what? That lady's in a corporation. How many times has her prejudicial perspective prevented an otherwise qualified person from progressing? So yeah, that looks good and it feels good, but people got to look at themselves. If you don't speak to me, you aren't out supporting the issues that impact me. You're not.
Yeah. Brandon, what do you think we're seeing, and are we going to see change?
It's interesting. I think the challenge, and I got to agree with Karen, is that we've got to make sure that in this movement, this is not just a fad. And I think, unfortunately, it's become the cool thing to do to protest when I think Black America has some very systematic issues that, quite frankly, I don't know if a protest will change. And so, I just read Netflix is now, as a way to counter, is giving $150 million towards Black education. So now the challenge is, okay, well, that's a good thing that corporations are starting to look at the riots and the protests and to do something about it. But now the question is, well, how is that money going to be allocated? What specific programs are going to be utilized? So what are the minutiae of how do we use that financial investment to enhance our communities? And that's still a big question. But then the other thing, when we look at the protests and riots, I think it's a systematic issue of something much deeper in our society, really looking at the failed policies that have come out of our inner cities, really looking at poverty. I think COVID, people can try to get away from it or not. COVID has unleashed so many issues from our public health system, all the way down to policing issues, all the way down to the haves and the have-nots, where now things are starting to come to the format of what are the real ills of society. The protest is just a symptom.
Kerry, you consider yourself a conservative. We've seen a lot of conservatives have odd reactions to this, especially the one in the White House, although a lot of conservatives would say he's not a conservative. But I'm curious, from your standpoint, is there something you're seeing now that's surprising? Is there something now that seems different than what we've seen before?
There's definitely something that I see now that is surprising. There's no way a month ago you could have told me that the protests would reach around the world and that you would have hundreds of thousands of people coming out. And I got to tell y'all, I don't think that they're coming out simply because they were all on lockdown because of COVID-19. They've all seen, the generation that's younger than us, they've seen something that they're tired of. We have asked for years for the good white people to be our allies and to try and somehow overcome the problems that we've had to fight all of these years. I think we've got a lot of white allies who are on our side, who are also, they're not just here in Detroit or in Minneapolis and Seattle, but they're all over the world, and they are sick and tired of what they're seeing. To answer the question you asked earlier, is there going to be change? There's definitely going to be change. Karen, there was change. There was there were several levels of change after the Black Panthers made the noise that they made in the 60s. After there were riots when Fred Hampton was killed, and because I'm from Maywood, Illinois, which is where he's from. Mm-hmm. after that noise was made, there was definitely some change. But yeah, we got complacent after a while. The problem that we have with the police, as I started saying with Karen the last time we all got together, because she thought that this was just a one or two bad apples per department, it's systemic. We have spent 30 years telling judges, prosecutors, and cops, you've got to ignore everybody's rights and get tough on crime. And this has led us to where we are now. We definitely have to get to a point of addressing the fact that there are police officers, black and white, in every department all over our country who have been trained to go out and knock people upside the head. It's not just that Mike Bloomberg said, stop and frisk them and rough them up. We have told police that for 30 years. And if you saw the Supreme Court the other day said, hey, if you do what we told you to do, we've got your back. We've got to change that. We've got to get rid of the immunity for the cops. We've got to get back to training them to the fact that people have rights. And I mean, I got to tell you, the things that you might see, like, you know, Quaker in there, oh, we're no longer going to say Aunt Jemima, or Walmart saying, we're not going to lock up the black products anymore. Yeah, I think that's just throwing meat to a dog to tell them to leave you alone. But I think that the fact that there are so many corporations involved, we surely have to see some sort of change that's going to come out from at least some of them.
Yeah. So let's talk about police and policing, which is sort of at the heart of all of this. There's a lot of people who say we've got to deconstruct essentially the police department as it stands now and reconstruct it with people's rights at the center of the institution. I think that's a great conversation to have. I worry that once we get into it, people can be uncomfortable with the idea of doing that. I also worry that some of the sloganeering that's happening, defund the police, dismantle the police, doesn't do us any favors in terms of trying to have the kind of sophisticated conversation that we need to about that. Brendan, what do you think about police reform?
So, Stephen, I'm glad you asked me because I'm actually the son of 2 law enforcement police officers. So I have a very different perspective on this. The unfortunate thing is, and I watched the video of George Floyd. I even go back to remember the Malice Green cases. The unfortunate thing is, you know, police brutality. I think we've got to be different on how do we fix police reform and not use slogans like defund the police. You don't want to defund the police at a time like this. But the other thing is we never often talk about the families of those officers who deal with and literally put their lives on the line daily. There's a respect issue there. And going a step further, I think one of the challenges is that kudos to the Detroit PAL League, but I think community policing is a strategy that for the city of Detroit has worked, that some cities literally don't have community policing programs as a way to bring suburban cops who choose not to live in the city that they serve in, to get them more acclimated with the communities that they serve. And so I do agree with restructuring police reform and police budgets, but I think it's got to be in things like community policing. It's got to be in sensitivity training. It's got to be in how do we create programs, Cops and Kids out in New York City, where they literally allow the cops to get to know the kids of the community and the families that they serve. That's important when we talk about how do we make sure that we can change this so that these type of things never happen again. Because let's be honest, the challenge that you have, and my parents dealt with it, is if you've got cops that work in the suburbs, literally the only time they're dealing with the city is when it's an issue of some kind of policing or something negative. How do we take that and turn it into a positive? Yeah. That's how we fix these policing issues, not create, defund the police slogans where now we create a us versus them mentality.
Yeah. Greg, people are talking even further than just retraining for police or new training or different training. People are talking about the department itself perhaps looking different. Why aren't there social workers, for instance, who maybe answer some calls with police? Why aren't the thing that I've been asking about is how come there isn't somebody with the police all the time whose job it is to protect the rights of the citizens they're interacting with? We keep talking about trying to hold them accountable after they've done something. Seems to me that accountability is necessary when they are doing these things. If there was somebody there like that when Officer Chauvin was interacting with George Floyd, that person would have said, "You can't do that. You got to stop, or you're going to kill that person." Are we going to see this actually happen, though, in American police departments?
Well, I do think that we are going to see some changes. When I spoke at the Black Lives Matter march, the last one that happened here at the Detroit Grosse Pointe border, one of the things that I had pointed out was that we have been schizophrenic about what we want from the police, and we are the ones that are in charge of the police. They're people. They don't exist by themselves, and they don't exist without us. And so we decide what the rules are, and we can change those rules. Now, we've asked cops to do everything from break up a fight between spouses to capture terrorists. You know what I mean? And I think that we have to be pretty clear about what we want. Part of our challenge is addressing the entire justice system and move away from this sort of warlike mentality, in that, the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on this, the war on that, and start looking at police officers and justice as a way to preserve life. I really think that we need to put the focus on preserving life. And if we're able to do that, then every interaction that our law enforcement, our justice system has should be geared towards preserving and protecting life.
Yeah.
And I think if we just start to make that one little change, it'll be better. Because what we're not seeing in a lot of these communities, whether it's Bloomfield Hills or St. Clair Shores or pick your place, is after an arrest is made and people go to court, a lot of times those courtrooms are filled disproportionately with Black and brown people.
Right.
They really are.
Yeah.
And I think that and when they get to those courtrooms, it's still stacked against them. And so we need to be able to address that level of enforcement. Trump is right. People are always, and at least on this one thing, people like to say that, he likes to say what Americans want is law and order. We all want law and order. We just don't want them doing law and order on us. I mean, go ahead and stop that guy, but don't stop me, because I don't look like that guy. I have on a suit and a polo shirt and da 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 da. And
Karen,
nothing that your suit won't protect you. Your suit won't hide your blackness.
Absolutely.
At risk.
Yeah. Karen, go ahead.
I forgot what I was going to say, but I do want to say this. There are some policy things, Greg, I get caught up in his description, but there are some policy things that will make a difference in terms of, sharing police records, the police officers, the things that they've done. But think about the officer that pushed down the older gentleman in the protest in New York, that he fell and hit his head. If you notice, there was another police officer that was about to reach down and help him, and that officer stopped him. So, you got to think about that too. Just having a policy, having a law, having a rule and a regulation on a book means one thing, but having that person receptive and willing to execute that is a completely different thing, and it cannot be overlooked. But I do think that if we remove some of the protective measures that exist for police officers, that it will have an impact.
Yeah. So we've only got about 3 minutes left. I want to get each of you very quickly to talk about what you think, what role does this play in the rest of this year, this issue? Does this shape the presidential election? Does this shape the way we deal with COVID-19, which is not gone, even though a lot of people are acting as though it is? Where do we go from here? Kerry, I'll start with you.
I think that we're definitely going to concentrate on those two issues for at least the next 6 months. Those of us that wear masks have to accept the fact that there are people in the world who are not going to wear masks. And we've got to do whatever we're going to do individually to protect ourselves and our families. But I still, as I said earlier, I've got a lot of faith in not just the fellow Americans, but the other people around the world, that there's going to be some definite change. It's just that, as one of you have already said, we've got to define exactly what we're asking for. And I think we need to spend the next 6 months at least trying to make sure that everybody's on the same page with what we're asking for, so that we'll all know what direction we're heading in.
Yeah. Brandon, go ahead.
I think the defund the police initiative is a very dangerous ploy for Democrats. And I think it actually indirectly strengthens the president's chances, because let's be honest, I mean, when our white brothers and sisters are scared, they typically vote conservative. And so I think that's a factor. But the real issue here, when, COVID obviously is an issue, and making sure that we stay safe, but I'm starting to also see a rise in homegrown terrorism that really needs to be addressed early. And so I think when the president talks about law and order, that law and order shouldn't just be for those who create havoc. It should be with some of these groups like Antifa and the Boogaloo brothers, and the Boogaloo movement and the militia groups that are starting to use this as a catalyst for recruitment. That's a serious issue.
Yeah. Karen?
I think that 2020 is going to be a year of reckoning. And I think that reckoning should be personal. I think it should be political. I think it should be policy driven. I think it should be at every level. But while we should collectively identify what it is that we want, I think that, as Greg pointed out and Kerry seconded, that's the missing component. In order for us to be effective, we have to identify what change looks like. In the interim, I would also like to see, Black people in this country really recognize and leverage their social, economic, and political capital. And I think that this is an opportunity to do so. And collectively, it can make a difference. For us to be deliberate about where we spend our time and our money, for us to uplift and not, cut down other people that look like us. It sounds simple, but it would make a tremendous difference. So things will continue to evolve. They'll continue to change. I think we need to be very deliberate and intentional about what it is that we're doing, and realize what will have the collective collective impact for the greater good.
I think that people need to drop their bucket where they are. Right here in southeastern Michigan, we've seen some examples of where that push is happening, and it needs to happen harder. The police chief in Shelby Township making all his racist, ignorant comments on Facebook got suspended. I think that kind of push needs to continue to happen. Maybe that guy should be fired. Police Chief William Dyer up there in Warren. Everybody saw that guy, that Amazon delivery driver, get beasted by the police, just doing his job. And what did Dwyer do? He tried to bring that guy up on some kind of federal charges. People need to confront him and his actions and say, why are you trying to overcharge the brother and let the cop go? He needs to be removed from office. We saw what happened in Harper Woods, where the young lady died in police custody. We don't know how that happened yet, and the Michigan State Police are investigating. That kind of situation, those folks need to be held to account there too.
As always, the time goes too fast when I have the four of you together, but it's also always really great. I'm really glad you were here. Thanks, Greg, Karen, Brandon, and Kerry for being on American Black Journal.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for having us.
You can find more at onedetroitpbs.org or subscribe to our social media channels and sign up for our One Detroit newsletter.